All right, what's up, everybody? This is Ryan, and you're watching another live lesson on Twitch in this case. Well, you might be watching it. Actually, most likely you're watching it on YouTube after the fact. So, welcome to the second live lesson, and this one's going to be a continuation of what I talked about last Monday, which was how to find jobs. And what I wanted to do today is talk about just a bunch of tips I have for interviews. So I have 8 different topics here, as you can see, and I plan to basically just go through and cover all these different topics, hopefully somewhat briefly, but I do tend to ramble, and just share what I think might be useful. And I guess it's probably worth mentioning a little bit about my qualifications. I am a professional software engineer. I work full time as an Android, well, actually a mobile developer. I've started doing some iOS stuff as well. But yeah, I actually have a job, and the past 2 jobs I've had, uh, both of them were in the context, particularly my current job, in the context of a very, very difficult job market for Android developers, which was brought about by sort of economic downturns and then also mass layoffs at companies like Twitter and Facebook and I believe Google as well to some degree. And the result of that was that not only was there fewer jobs around, but there was a more saturated talent pool. So, yeah, I think I know a thing or two about getting a job, at least as a mobile developer. But regardless of what you're trying to do, this will be general advice for technical or programmer interviews. I'm not actually going to be giving you any specific information about Android problems. I might maybe use some as examples, although I don't have any prepared. But this is going to be general advice for technical interviews. All right, so these are all the topics that I have for today, or all the points. And so let's just go ahead and get started. So this is something I really like to emphasize to people because similar to test taking, very often people kind of get it in their head that cramming is a good idea. And what I personally do before an interview, particularly 1 to 2 hours before an interview, I try to relax as much as possible. The only thing I might do that's like remotely sort of research based is I might check out the company's apps or sites. I might spend a little bit of time just looking at their products so that it's fresh in my head. But for the most part, I'm just going to relax. And what that looks like is going to depend on what works for you. I'll generally take like a 20 to 30 minute walk. If you're into meditation, that would be a great time to do it. But the goal here is you basically want to just calm yourself down. And the reason why this is useful is a number of things, but most importantly, and this is more than just a tip for interviews, this is like a tip for communicating with people in general. The more relaxed you feel, it will tend to make others around you more relaxed. Conversely, if you're like super anxious, you might get lucky and have really nice interviewers. That does happen, but you'll tend to make the people around you less comfortable. How you feel internally is going to really affect things that occur externally. And I've had a lot of direct experience in this regard. So that's what I suggest for before the interview. Find some ritual. You could also like listen to some music or whatever you want to do, but find some way to relax. Don't cram. And some of you might be tempted to think, oh, well, I should maybe research technical questions and memorize them and quiz myself. I really don't suggest you do that. If you feel like you need to do that an hour and a half before an interview, you probably didn't prepare properly. Maybe you have like absolutely zero time. I'm sure there's some situation where that might be like justified, but for the most part, unless you're extraordinarily busy, you really shouldn't be cramming, and I don't suggest you do that. So that's my personal tips for before an interview starts. So let's assume you've started the interview, and this is a question that's going to come up in sort of like technical screen interviews or recruiter interviews or like HR interviews, all the way up to like final interviews with managers. So this is a very important question that you will be asked, and it's most often the first thing, apart from like, hi, how are you, that you're going to be asked in an interview, which is, tell me about yourself. Now, there's a way to answer this question which is useful, and there's a way to answer this question which is not so useful. Years ago, I saw from various places some suggestions about answering this, which sort of talked about like maybe share some hobbies that might be interesting or something like that. And my advice to you is to not really do that at all, but actually keep your answer almost entirely relevant to the position slash job. You can include a few details, like you could share maybe where you live if you're applying for a remote job, for example. But really what you're going to want to say is like, let me give you an example. So it is 6:36 a.m. and I was up at 5, so my brain's not super awake. But if I was to answer this question, somebody says, tell me about yourself, I would probably say something along the lines of, hello, my name is Ryan. I'm an Android developer. I started developing Android applications in 2014. Around 2016, I started teaching people how to create Android applications and solve problems with YouTube tutorials. And I continued to do that and build my own projects up until about 2020, at which time I was able to land my first Android developer role. And then I might say I'm interested in this position for these reasons. Keep it like pretty short and sweet. Don't give like a biography, and almost all of it should be relevant to the job and your experience. If you want to include a hobby or something that might be interesting, but like you're not filling out a Tinder bio or something like that, is what I'm trying to say. Keep it relevant. 90% of it should be relevant to the job. I think that's a big mistake I used to make. And I think probably a lot of people make this mistake because there are things floating around, answers to this question probably which weren't really designed for technical interviews, which gives some pretty conflicting advice. So that's my suggestion to you. Keep it short, a couple sentences. Feel free to talk about things that are like tangentially related. Like I always brought up the fact that I created tutorials and have a number of published articles and stuff like that. I always brought up certain things and might share that I love to teach and stuff like that. But all of these things are actually relevant to the job, is what I'm trying to say here. All right, so let's move on to number 3, which is technical questions. So technical questions can show up kind of in, I would say, 2 primary forms. So one of them could be, and it's why I love doing these live streams is I get to interact with people. And last live stream I did on YouTube, which was on Wednesday, someone who I've known since like 2016, I think, Wojtek Kalaczynski, who worked at Google for years, I was kind of going back and forth a little bit with him about interview process and questions and that kind of things. And he gave like a really good, concise way of describing this one kind of interview, which is like questions. There's questions that provoke a discussion, and then you'll also get interviews who basically, it's like Jeopardy style questions. So basically like a quiz. And these are generally the 2 kinds of technical questions that I found you'll get. And I find usually it will tend to be one or the other. So when it comes to Jeopardy style questions, generally speaking, this interview is going to be trying to ascertain your specific knowledge on specific things. I'll be honest, I think that's of limited value. Because the thing about this is, depending on what kind of questions you ask, um, it's sort of equivalent to like asking someone things that they might just Google. With that being said, I think there are some like pretty straightforward questions you can ask, but for the most part, hopefully you get an interview which provokes a discussion. So let me give a quick example, and this is a common interview question. Um, for Android interviews, the questions vary a lot. There's not a lot of common threads, but you will almost always get asked something about the view system and oftentimes efficiency of the view system. So a common question might be, explain the difference between a list view and a recycler view. And for you non-Android developers out there, the answer to that question is essentially a recycler view has the view holder pattern baked into the source code, which makes it more efficient for loading very large data sets, whereas the list view doesn't. So that would be like the quiz style answer to that question. You're just giving like a really correct, but not super straightforward, or correct and very concise answer. But depending on what kind of interview you're getting, you might be able to add on to that. You might be able to say that back in the day, we used to just add the view holder pattern to a list view and make it do the same thing. And the details have leaked out of my brain because I don't really work with list views very much, but there's a way to do that which isn't actually that difficult to do with a couple of the functions that are overridden or can be overridden in a list view. Anyways, so what I'm trying to point at here is with technical questions, depending on what your interviewer's looking for, some of them will just want you to answer it really quickly and concisely. Some of them will want to provoke a discussion. And in the case of the discussion questions, that's when you can really expand on things and try to include relevant information. And this is going to be tough for you if you don't have a lot of experience, but if you do have quite a bit of experience solving problems, then you'll probably be able to like share some really useful information. So regardless of whether you're getting like a A style question or B style question, there's some general tips. Always clarify. Never feel stupid because you don't understand the question you're being asked, or try to answer the question if you're not 100% sure. Always clarify. You will look a lot better, believe me, if you have a clear idea of what the person is asking. We'll talk a little more about that in the coding and logic problems thing. But yeah, always clarify, ask questions. If your interviewer is upset at you asking questions to clarify, you pretty much almost certainly don't want to work there, or you've just come across someone who's not a very good interviewer. That's my personal opinion. And then this is a really, really important one that a lot of people screw up, and a lot of this comes from ego. A lot of this comes from being terrified of not knowing the answer to a question. But I don't know is a very good answer to give if you don't know what you're talking about. Let me give you an example, if I can even remember. So there's like there's one common way to do network communications for mobile applications. The really common way to do it is using REST and HTTP. If you're an Android developer, you've almost certainly heard of OKHTTP and retrofit. And then there are many other less common ways, but one of the sort of somewhat less common ways is to use GraphQL. And this is something that will come up very commonly in interviews is like, okay, are you familiar with REST? Have you ever worked with it? Yes, I have. Are you familiar with GraphQL? And in my case, I've never worked in an application which used GraphQL. I'm aware that it exists. And if I'm asked, what situation would you prefer to use GraphQL over REST or REST/HTTP? My answer would be, I actually don't know. I've never worked with it. And that's basically it. So I'm absolutely comfortable saying I don't know if I don't know the answer. Now, this is a really important thing here. When you come across a question you don't know, this is your opportunity to ask a question to your interview, and your question should be framed around one of two things. So what is the answer to that question, if you feel like it's something that can be answered briefly, or where can I find an answer, which is another way of saying, can you suggest a resource to find the answer to that question? So what I'm saying is, when you run into something you don't know, this is a perfect time to ask your interviewer, I don't know, so what would you suggest, or what use case for this particular thing would it be useful? And this does a number of cool things, and I really hope, if you don't take, well, there's a number of things I really hope you take from this talk, but one of the key things I hope you take from this talk is asking questions of the interviewer does some interesting things. Firstly, you will become smarter if you remember what they say to you. Secondly, it's going to build rapport, which is this fancy... oh, sorry, I kind of jumped ahead here. So I jumped ahead to number 6, but let's just throw this in here. Technical questions / asking questions. Sorry, it's early in the morning, but so you will build rapport, which is this French word here. And what rapport means is like your relationship to the people around you. So if I worked in sales for years, so rapport could be my relationship with my customers. If I have good rapport, they trust me, they're open, they like me. That's basically what this word rapport means. Asking questions in an interview does this interesting thing where it actually sort of can take the frame of the conversation, the interaction, and change it a little from interviewer-interviewee to technical people having a discussion about a technical thing. And when that frame changes, I'm not saying it's going to be the difference between you getting a job or not, but it can give the interviewer an idea of what you are actually like when you ask them a question and you're curious to know. And it can also give you an idea of what the interviewer, who you might be working with, is like. And this is a very valuable tool. It's like a preview. If I was an interviewer, I would really be paying attention to this. And I really can't understate the difficulty. And then finally, being able to say, I don't know. If I was interviewing someone and I asked them a question and they gave me an answer where they clearly had no idea what they were talking about, but really wanted to sound like they did, that would be a gigantic red flag, like huge. Because what that would be telling me is, okay, this person's one of those types that really needs to protect their ego, and that means they might feed me BS in order to try to do that. And I don't ever really want to work with people like that. So much better to just say, I don't know. So yeah, I think that's all I kind of wanted to say about these 2 points. But for technical questions, these are the things that I suggest for you. And really learn how to ask questions. And that change in frame is really valuable in my opinion. Okay, now we have coding or logic problems. So this would be things like everything from brain teasers to DSA, data structures and algorithms problems. Now, I'm going to give you some general tips here. The first one is, if you know you are going to be interviewing in a company which is going to be asking you these sorts of questions. So great example, Meta. I've been through the process with Meta several times. They will ask you all kinds of DSA questions, and very few of them will have any bearing on anything you'll ever do in your coding life or work, but you're going to get asked them anyways. So if you know you are going to get asked a ton of coding problems, then you need to practice a lot. In my case, I was able to make it to the final round with Meta. I didn't get the job, and I actually am okay with that, because every one of the engineers I spoke to during the virtual on-site interview had a pretty miserable work-life balance. So it is what it is. But yeah, I practiced hard for 3 months. And what, oops, that's not what I wanted to do. Here's what I actually practiced. So firstly, implementing DSA. So this means open up a project in VS Code or Android Studio or Xcode or whatever you use and actually build some basic DSA. So you're going to want to do linked list. You're going to want to do a hash map / hash table, whatever. You're going to want to probably know how to do a stack / queue. And there's a lot more you could do, but like knowing some basic graph DS stuff like trees / nodes and things like that. Trees and nodes aren't necessarily strictly graph related, so I should put this sort of, let's say nodes and then basic trees. So you're going to want to actually build these things sort of by hand, so to speak. And then you're probably going to have to practice. Now, I do suggest you do this first, because in my case, it helped me solve the problems better and know when to use a particular data structure. But you're going to want to then practice lots of problems. I have like a whole process I go through that I worked out through a resource I'm going to give you in a moment, and then also my own approach to solving DSA problems through a lot of experience, what works for me. I'm not going to give you that whole process because it's a lengthy thing, but let me suggest this to you. Read Cracking the Code interview by Gail Lockman McDowell. I don't remember exactly her full name, but you're going to want to read this book, not necessarily cover to cover, but you're going to want to do this, honestly. And then the final thing I want to say is about these sort of technical problems. At the end of the day, in my opinion, your ability to solve obscure DSA problems doesn't mean you're going to be a great developer. It means you're really good at solving those sorts of problems. Let me give you an example. It could be the difference between being really good at putting like nails in a board, but that doesn't tell me that you're going to be able to build a house. So take these sorts of interviews with a grain of salt and don't let them kind of blow your self-esteem away. Because it's honestly not, in my opinion, the best way to determine if someone's going to be a good employee. But, you know, it is what it is. It's going to depend on the company's hiring policy or the hiring people, their hiring policy. Okay. Next we have behavioral. This should say behavioral questions or behavioral problems, which is kind of hilarious. I certainly have a few of those. All right. So behavioral questions. There's a couple really key questions that you're going to be asked in behavioral interviews almost always, and this is one of the few things in interviews that I find pretty consistent, is these two questions. So the first one being, talk about a time you dealt with conflict in a team, or maybe just conflict, whatever. Talk about a time you dealt with conflict, and then talk about a time when you exceeded your expectations / were very, oops, that's not what I wanted to do. We're very proud. Like what they're asking here is, tell us about something you did good in plain English. And you are going to want to have stories, hopefully real ones, prepared to answer these questions. Talk about a time you dealt with conflict. Talk about a time when you exceeded your expectations. The way that, so I have a number of these stories because I've worked with a lot of people, and do keep in mind if you only have stories that are like outside of programming, like maybe you have a story about that time you worked in a fish and chip shop and got in an argument with someone that was a misunderstanding. That would be, you could use that as an example here. I think it's ultimately, if you have a good example in the context of a coding job, that's probably what you want to pick. But if you don't, feel free to pick whatever sort of work situation you want. The key thing is, have a story in mind and practice giving the answer. And it's a little tricky here because you don't want to spend forever answering this question, but you also don't want to necessarily give a really short answer here. So just practice it. If it takes you like maybe more than 5 minutes to answer the question, like if you record yourself answering this question and you've been rambling for 10 minutes, that's too much. You need to trim it down. But I would say like 3 to 5 minutes is acceptable, in my opinion. That's just my opinion. And another key thing, so have the story in mind. Oops, let's go back to WordPad mode here. And make sure that this story demonstrates good qualities in your case. So I'm not saying that you should pick a story where you're like, oh yeah, my manager was a jerk and I told him so, or something like that, because that is not going to help. I'm not going to give specific details, but I have a story from a previous role where 2 of my team members, there was a lot of friction going on because one of them was like really not listening well at all and not really respecting the chain of command. And there were reasons why that was the case, but yeah. And then the other coworker involved was getting very upset about this. And what I did in that particular case is I made sure to listen to the upset coworker and let them vent. We like jumped on a call. So I made sure to hear them out and let them vent their emotions and calm down. And then I said, well, how about I go to this coworker and tell them, hey, you really need to stop doing this. And then that way it doesn't look like you are just attacking them repeatedly. And upset coworker was happy with that solution. And so we did that. And the result of that is I was able to calm both parties down. Well, calm one of them down and then give the message to the other one that like, you really need to not commit directly to master. So anyways, and of course, like the person unfortunately continued not to listen very well, but in that particular situation, that was a good solution. So what am I demonstrating with that story? And that was a true story. I gave you a very short version. What I'm demonstrating is empathy. So like listening to people, a desire to not have my coworkers arguing and to de-escalate. And then also a desire to make sure that like the message actually gets communicated. Like, hey, you need to not do that, my friend. So see if you can find something along those lines. And yet don't do a story. Some people might have pretty poor self-awareness in this case, but maybe ask a friend about your story and just make sure that it's not something that's going to make you look really terrible. And then talk about a time when you exceeded your expectations or something like this. So in this case, hopefully you have a problem, a technical problem that was really difficult that you were able to solve. I've got a number of different examples. I've been coding, somewhat regularly since 2014. So I've got quite a few examples of this, and I'm not going to give one in this particular case, but like pick a problem you solved, and a couple things about it. So enthusiasm is good. Try to communicate why it was challenging. And if you're speaking with technical people, I would advise you go into some level of technical detail. I might give you a quick example at the end of one I use periodically, one of these example stories. So yeah, enthusiasm is good. Let me see if I have other notes here. Yeah, so enthusiasm is good. Try to communicate why it was challenging. And I think those are the main things. The main thing I want to demonstrate here is excitement, enthusiasm about solving difficult problems. So yeah. I'll give you a quick example. We don't have a ton of time, but a quick example for me, in a previous application, I had to build a feature where basically there was a list view, recycler view it was, but like a series of cards, and they had calendars. And so it was like a calendar-based widget for a whole year, actually any date in the future. And each of these things you had to be able to like block weekends, block weekdays, clear the whole calendar, or select individual items in this calendar. And this was actually turned out to be an extremely difficult task that I was able to solve using test-driven development. So I jumped to that example because I can explain pretty quickly why this is a challenging problem, because anyone who's ever worked with the Java date and time API knows that it's kind of a train wreck. There's like the new Java time API, but dealing with dates and times in programming is tricky in general. And then I'm able to demonstrate that explain that I used TDD in this particular case because I had to, because the algorithms were so difficult that I had to incrementally prove them. So that's kind of one of my go-to stories. And then the last sort of section here will be, where do you see yourself in X years? And generally X will equal something like 2 or maybe 5 years or something like that. And so what the interviewers are kind of trying to get here is like, what do you want to do? Like, do you want to get into a leadership position? Do you want to explore different technologies? Those would be sort of the main things that, or do you want to just only be an engineer and stay in your lane? And I don't think there's right or wrong answers here. You might be able to give an answer which is like a little bit tailored towards what you think the interviewers want, but my general suggestion is to just be honest. And if they like you, they'll probably take you on. I think that's better than blowing smoke up somebody's ass, which is an English expression for lying. I think that's all the questions. Yeah. So just to reiterate here, the key with these behavioral questions is have a situation you went through in the past ready and practice answering it, and just make sure that it's demonstrating good qualities. And self-awareness is key. Be careful, like, don't tell a story where it's all like, I'm amazing and I solved all the problems and my team sucked, but luckily I was there to quarterback the whole thing. Like, you got to be careful how you answer these. If you are a narcissist or something like that and you don't have a lot of self-awareness, then you could potentially shoot yourself in the foot pretty quickly. So, pro tip. Next we have asking questions after. So this will be the period, almost always, if your interviewers are nice people, there will be a period at the end where the interviewers will say, do you have any questions for us? Now, when I was a junior developer, my typical answer was like, no, not really. And then as I've gained more and more experience, I've learned that there are lots of questions that I like to ask, and I'll generally try to choose these questions that I ask based on how the interview went. But here's my advice. So I do suggest you ask some questions. Let me give you a couple key ones. These are ones that I would commonly ask. On a scale from poor to very good, how would you rate your work-life balance? I remember when I went through interviews at Meta, not a single person I asked gave me a very good. None of them. And that was a big red flag. So this is one I like to ask. And so this is just a good common one you can ask. If you're concerned about like benefits or something like that, you could ask that. One you could ask is, what tools do you use internally for communication? If they say Microsoft Teams, then just tell them, no thanks, I don't want to work for you. I'm joking, but yeah, that would kind of suck if they use Teams. Not, this is kind of a filler question. But this is something that is sort of, in my opinion, apart from this work-life balance one, I personally care about work-life balance a lot, but ask technical questions about projects, about the team's projects or code bases. So this would be something where, let's say something came up during your interview. Or maybe this is an app you've been using for a very long time. And there's something about that application that you're curious about. So let me give you an example. I was interviewing with a company that does a messaging app. I'm not going to say which one. It's definitely not Teams, but it does a messaging app, and I can basically guarantee you have used or are using the app internally, but that's all I'll say. And an interview question came up where they asked me about deciding the source of truth based on like a timestamp regarding a message which had been drafted. So in this application, you can start drafting a note on like your phone, and then that draft will show up on your other computers if you happen to open them. And I find that quite useful. Sometimes I even use that as like a notepad a clipboard between different devices. And I was curious how they did that exactly. So I asked them, and here's a key thing. I often preface these technical questions with, in as much detail as you are allowed to share, because some of these things can be proprietary things, but you can say in as much detail as you're allowed to share, which shows that you're sensitive to the fact that you might be asking something which, is proprietary, but as much detail as you're allowed to share. How did you solve this? How did you solve X problem or something like that? And I've actually been frequently surprised the level of detail that people will actually go into. Tom1604 says better Microsoft Teams than WebEx. I've never actually used WebEx, so it must be pretty terrible. And as much as I rip on Microsoft Teams, I've heard it's gotten slightly better. So yeah. So that's really what I suggest you do. Asking technical questions about the team's projects or code bases. This is great because it can even demonstrate to your interviewers that you're asking relevant questions that might be practically useful to understand. So I've got 20 minutes left. I'll say a few things about feedback, and then I'll open up for Q&A if anyone has any questions. Otherwise, we'll call it a day. The last one is, and when I first wrote this, I said, always request feedback. And then later on, I said, consider requesting feedback, because I'll be honest, I have done a few interviews or a few coding challenges where I thought, I dislike this process so much that I don't even really want your feedback. But that's kind of my general thing here, is consider requesting feedback. This is an annoying one because I actually find that I almost never get good feedback from companies in the past. Most of the time, so I was doing a lot of job hunting last year and the year before, and most of the time the answer that I would get would be like, we liked you, it's just there were a number of really strong candidates, and then no specific feedback. But regardless, this is something I'll still do in the future. But yeah. All right, so that is my talk on interviews. I could here ask, how do you handle boredom in mid-job search? To me, the most important thing is have a schedule. Have a schedule. So what that schedule looks like is going to depend on you. For me, I would probably want to spend maybe 1 to 2 hours at the start of the day devoted to like personal, mental / physical health. This is just really good for mood and overall health. I would do 3 to 4, let's say 2 to 4, it depends on what you've built up to, hours of coding practice. So especially if you're going to do Leetcode style interviews at Meta or whatever, you're going to want to do some coding practice of some kind. And then maybe 1 to 2 hours of sending out resumes / CVs. This would be the most important thing. And the rest of your day, you can do whatever, like schedule time in to relax, play video games, whatever you want to do. And what I would say here is if you don't already have a schedule, start really easy. Literally, like if you have no schedule and no structure in your life, just start with 2 hours a day. Keep it like really, and then slowly build up. If you can be consistent with 1 to 2 hours a day of just coding practice or sending out resumes, then you can start to add some more time over like a weekly process. Don't just like, I'm going to jump into doing 8 hours and then expect that my mind's going to like actually behave, because that's not really how human brains work. That's what I would suggest. Tom1604 asks, should I apply to mid-senior positions even if I'm junior? I would probably not apply to senior positions, but here's the interesting thing. Taking interviews is a skill which is best built through practice. So if you don't have a lot of experience in interviews and you happen to get an interview for a senior position, why not? Volume is key. Volume is very, very important, and building that skill of interviewing is really important. For mid-level ones, I would say absolutely, because you might get lucky. You might run into a company where maybe the previous Android developer claimed that they were senior, but they were actually terrible. And so you might actually look pretty good. And be really wary of like the descriptions they give, like 5 to 7 years of Kotlin Android development, and they'll give this big long list of things. And I find those lists can be pretty silly. Like if you are a very talented junior developer who's only been doing things for 2 years, you might still have a chance. So the short answer is yes, probably. So how about Android mobile system design, building an app in 90 minutes / bug bash? How to prepare for those parts. So for mobile system design, this one's pretty tricky to prepare for. So I can speak from personal experience. When I interviewed at Meta, I had 2 system design interviews. Or no, was it two? No, I think it was actually just one system design interview. And I was given a really tricky problem. I won't tell you what it is because I signed an NDA, but I was given a really nasty problem. Um, Honestly, I would watch YouTube videos to get a general sense of how these things are done. And then, but realize that if you're being interviewed for an Android or a mobile position, I should say, you're probably not going to be expected to, you know, like detail how you would design a load balancer. Like if it's like an intermediate level mobile developer position and they're asking you intricate details about the backend, then that's just not fair unless you have said that you have that experience. So really just worry about the client side for starters. And I can't really give you like a really short answer on this one, but there's YouTube videos out there which cover these sorts of things. And get really, so if you know ahead of time what tool the interview is going to be conducted in, like for example, there's a tool you can use called Excalidraw, which is terrific. I actually still use that at work sometimes to make diagrams. Get really good in at least one of these programs, because even if you can or are good at system design, that doesn't necessarily mean you'll be able to build that design quickly on screen. So iCode here says, for mobile system, I try to build apps, but I'm really bored building a to-do app, news, movies app, and want to build something meaningful. Any idea how to handle that? Yeah, sure. What I would suggest for you is, so pick a project which you are personally interested in and start with an MVP. So MVP meaning minimum viable product, and then expand from there. This is what I suggest. The first two applications that I ever built, mobile applications, were things that I was personally interested in using. There was a workout logging app and a posture correction app, which were both things which were things that personally interested in me. So that's really what I would suggest here, because probably a lot of the boredom you're dealing with is a lack of interest. If the problems aren't interesting to you, then it's actually quite difficult for your mind to learn. Interest. So my understanding from taking courses that covered cognition, so learning, one thing I learned from that, at least at the time, the theory was that interest is directly tied to cognition or learning. And I do think that's true. That's been my experience as well. So try to find something personally interesting to you. Maybe you play a video game and you could build some app which is useful for that, or maybe you're really into playing tic-tac-toe. Like, I don't know. But try to find something that's personally interesting to you. Kind of an obvious answer, but that's my main suggestion. Another thing you can do is, instead of setting goals based on outcomes, set goals based on efforts. And this has been one of the most important shifts I ever made, which I started doing a couple years ago. So make the schedule your goal instead of the end result. And if you make following the schedule your goal, every time you follow the schedule, you get to go, yippee, I did a good thing. I feel good about myself and I'm making progress. Whereas when it comes to building projects, it's actually really difficult to estimate how long something is going to take. And so let's say you wanted to build an app in 2 weeks, which is kind of a joke depending on the app. And 5 weeks later, you're halfway. You're probably going to be feeling pretty unmotivated because you're like, I'm not going to feel good until I get this goal. But this goal is far away and moving rapidly. If you have a schedule and you make, okay, I did 1 hour of walking. I walked for 1 hour outside. Cool, check. I feel good about myself. I did 2 hours of coding practice. Cool, great. Did it. Got it done. I spent 1 hour sending out resumes. boom, you feel good. And as long as you're following that schedule, you're feeling good about yourself and you're motivated. This is really, to me, a really important shift. When I started doing this, I would, my sort of depressive, unproductive episodes in my life were cut down quite drastically. There's a lot of other reasons why that happened, but this was an important one. Focus on efforts instead of goals. Put the time in is basically what I'm saying. All right, I've got time for maybe one more question. Yeah, no worries. Thank you for asking questions. When you do a live stream, it's always nice when people do that. And don't forget to follow me. And by the way, for the people who are listening, this will be available on my YouTube channel later on. So feel free to, you can watch the whole episode, and I'll try to do timestamps. The previous lesson that I gave here on Twitch is available already on YouTube, which talked about finding jobs. So that's something you're probably going to want to check out. Anyways, we've only got 5 minutes left, and I think I'm going to call it for today. So just to give you an idea of my schedule, on Mondays, I stream on Twitch at 6:30 a.m. Pacific time, so whatever that is for you. And then on Wednesdays, I stream on YouTube at the same time. And during the Wednesday YouTube streams, I do just pure Q&A. There's no lesson. On the Twitch days, on Mondays, I give a lesson. So that's basically how it works. And I do Q&A if I have time. Anyways, I've got to start work in 35 minutes. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you all have a good day or night or whatever it is for you. Peace out.